How do you handle change when your world changes overnight? Today is no longer the same as yesterday, and we really don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. How do you handle change like this, especially when God is the one responsible for that turmoil and stress? Today we're looking at that very issue in the life of Abraham. But first, you need coffee. Good morning and welcome to my humble abode. I hope you're all doing well, and I'm teaching from home just as a precaution for all of you. Hopefully we can deliver some high quality material until we can meet once again in person. Today we're going to continue our looking at the lectionary readings from Genesis chapter 12. This passage is called the Lech-Lecha in the Jewish readings from the Torah. The title Lech-Lecha comes from the 5th and 6th words in Genesis chapter 12. And the Lord said to Abraham, "Go out." And those words, "go out," and the address to you, is where Lech-Lecha comes from. Lech is command from the verb halak, which means to walk, to go somewhere, to depart. And so literally, reading there in Genesis chapter 12 is go out and walk. And then the lecha is the preposition lambda plus the pronoun you. So it's really this very emphatic you go out and walk. Now, in order to understand this story, we need to back up to Genesis chapter 11, verse 27. That's where the story of Abraham starts. And the thing we need to realize here is that the first 11 chapters of Genesis have all been sort of a preface, a prologue, to get us into this. 11:27 is really the hinge where we transfer into the real meat of the Torah. So let's take a look at 11:27. Genesis 11:27 verses 28 starts off with, "This is the account of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nor, Haran, and Haran became the father of Lot. Haran died in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans, while his father Terah was still alive." Now, the first thing I want you to notice here is that if you were going to tell the story in the ancient world about the founding of a nation, you would include a great warrior, a conquest, establishing a kingdom, valor, sacrifice, these great heroic acts. But that's not the way this story starts. Now, the first thing I want you to notice is that Terah sets out from Ur with his 3 kids. Now, you can imagine they're setting out, and Abraham's going around passing out MIGA hats. Make Israel great again. And everybody would be looking at him in the caravan going, "Dude, you're the only one. You're married, but you don't even have any children. All you have here are kind of some nephews, nieces, and slaves that are going with us. In 3 generations from now, they're going to end up being slaves in the land of Egypt." This is not the way to start the great story of the founding of your nation. But that's how it all starts in the Old Testament, with these very unassuming beginnings. The other thing I want you to notice here is right at the very start there in verse 27, it says, "This is the account of Terah." And that account, or the generations of, is the Todoleth. Talked about this in Genesis chapter 2. These are the generations of creation that the Lord made in the days he made it, the heavens and the earth. Now, this listing of generations here in Genesis chapter 11:27 is very interesting. Up until now, the pattern has been to list 10 generations, but this listing only has 8. This has led a lot of commentators to speculate the fact that Abraham has no children, and we only have 8 generations listed and 2 more to come, really sets up sort of like an anticipation, a foreshadowing about what's going to take place in this story. Now, the fact that Sarah is barren is important for 2 reasons. First off, in Genesis and throughout the Old Testament, we constantly see God working in ways that we don't expect. He picks Seth rather than Cain or Abel. He's going to pick David, the youngest of Jesse's children. God constantly works in ways that we don't expect. So Sarah's age and that she's barren is very important because this sets up the crisis for Abraham's life. The second thing is, the reason that Sarah reached a ripe old age is probably because she did not have children. The average age for a woman would be somewhere in their mid-20s, because just the fact of bearing repetitive children would lead to all sorts of complications and diseases, and a lot of women died in their mid-20s. If they made it past the childbearing ages, they could expect to reach the ripe old age of around 40, which is what most men lived to at that time. Now we can see from the map here, Ur of the Chaldeans is really down there at sort of the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And they set out, they go upriver, all the way up into modern day northeastern, northwestern Iraq or Syria, in that region there, where a lot of the conflict today is taking place. And this is where Terah, it looks like, settles down. Now this journey so far has been around 700 miles. In Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 we get the Lech-Lecha. You go out from your country and your kindred. Abraham's departing from Ur of the Chaldeans up through Haran and then down into Canaan and into Egypt. It really sets in motion the grand narrative of the Old Testament. Now when God commands Abraham to go out from his homeland, this creates profound changes. We really can't even begin to understand the changes and the challenge that Abraham has faced here. He is being told to go out from his homeland, from the people who speak the same language as his, share the same culture, eat the same food. They have no idea at all who they're going to encounter on the trip, whether it's going to be hostile or people that are going to be receptive to them in any way at all. And so in this way, Abraham is a model of faith for his descendants, especially the Israelites wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And just one little side note here at this point. Don's not going to charge you for this, I'm just going to throw it in for free. But it's said that we live in a 50-mile-per-hour world. And we need to bring this up because Abraham lived in a 3-mile-per-hour world. That's how fast they traveled. And that travel speed also determined the scope of their world. In other words, it determined how far you could travel in one day's journey, who you could do business with, who you could associate with, friends, family, and various things like this. You had about a 20-mile radius around your house that constituted your social world. If Abraham was able to walk each day, or we could say Terah, from Ur to Haran, that's about a 750-mile trip. Best case they would have is that trip would have cost them a month worth of solid walking. So when God tells Abraham to set out again, they've already walked an incredible distance. This brings us to verses 2 and 3 of Genesis chapter 12. In those verses, God says, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will exemplify divine blessing. I will bless those who bless you, but the one who treats you lightly or curses you, I will curse. And all the families of the earth will be blessed through your name. The 5 blessings that are mentioned here are all attendant upon Abraham going out. And the idea that you will be a blessing, I will bless those who bless you, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed, then sets up this longer trajectory within the Bible of how are the nations of the earth going to be blessed. Well, it's through Abraham's heir, Jesus Christ. Through Jesus, all the nations are going to be blessed. And the other thing to realize is that when Jesus dies on the cross and is resurrected, he gives a very, very similar command to the church as God gave to Abraham here, Matthew 28:18. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. In other words, this promise that's given to Abraham is fulfilled through Jesus Christ. And the command that is given to Abraham is then shouldered upon the church. Because the blessing that's given to Abraham to make him a great nation is going to take generations to fulfill. You know that he's only going to have one child through Sarah, Isaac. It's not until Jacob that you get 12 children. But even with them, they end up down in Egypt as slaves. So within 3 generations, we've only got 12 children and their wives, if they're all married. So this great nation has, within 3 generations, has only reached a total of 24 people so far. So these promises are going to take a long time. And to make them a great nation, we also need to realize that after those 3 generations, they're going to spend 400 years as slaves in Egypt. Well, slaves are not a great nation. We would not call this the fulfillment of the promises that are given to Abraham. These promises are going to take a long time to fulfill, and I would say that they're not even fully fulfilled or realized to this day. And we need to realize this because what we are as members of the church, as members of Christ's body, we are being called into something that extends way beyond us time-wise and will continue to extend until Christ comes again. We need to have a very long-term perspective here, because if we go back and look at Abraham, where this thing really starts, it's very incipient there, and we're heirs of it today, and it's not fully realized even yet. Okay, that needs a drink of coffee, sorry. In verse 4, when we pick up Abraham's journey, what I want you to realize is that the journey that's recorded here is very selective. Notice only 3 sites in the land of Canaan are mentioned: Shechem, Bethel, and Ai, and the Negev. So verse 4, it says, Abraham left, or Abraham went out, just as the Lord told him to do. So we see his model of faith and obedience there. And Lot went with him. Verse 5, and Abraham took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all their possessions they had accumulated, and all the people they had acquired in Haran. So they set out from Haran. They left for the land of Canaan. They entered Canaan. Abram traveled as far as the oak tree of Moriah at Shechem. So here's the first reference. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So Abram built an altar to the Lord there, and he worshipped. Then he moved from there to the hill country of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and worshipped the Lord. And Abraham continued journeys by stages down to the Negev. And the Negev is a desert region south of Jerusalem. So why is Canaan mentioned as the promised land? Well, you need to realize that where Abraham came from, the Tigris and Euphrates River, the land of Ur, has very, very highly advanced and large civilizations. They're going down to Egypt, which also has a very, very highly advanced and powerful civilization. But this land of Canaan along the coast there of the Mediterranean is sparsely populated and it has small kingdoms. And they're small because this land lies between the 2 great superpowers, Assyria, Babylon, the Chaldeans, the Sumerians earlier on, and Egypt to the south. And these 2 superpowers are constantly waging war against each other. And every time they do, their armies go through the land of Canaan. As a result, these small nations there are constantly at threat from these greater superpowers and forming alliances to them. So when it talks about, I will give you the land of Canaan, this is an area where the people could move into. It's sparsely populated. It doesn't have powerful kingdoms. This is not something that they could do in Egypt. This is not something they could do along the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys. The kingdoms and the empires there are way too big and powerful. The second thing I want you to realize is the 3 names, Shechem, Bethel, and Negev. The biblical authors could have told us a lot of things. Notice, this is like a 700-mile trip again from Haran down to Egypt. The author only tells us 3 locations, Shechem, Bethel, Ai, and Negev. This is important because when Jacob has to flee his brother and go to Laban's house, the story talks about these 3 sites as well. And then during the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, you have these 3 sites mentioned there as well. The journey from Ur, around, and then down into Egypt really forms the grand arc within the Old Testament. That Israel is going to go down into Egypt for 400 years as slaves. They're going to inhabit the promised land, but they're constantly going to be at war with these superpowers until finally Assyria will come and take the 10 northern tribes off into slavery and we'll never see them again. And then Babylon, which conquers Assyria, is going to come and take Judah off to the land where Ur is. And when they return, they're retracing the same steps that Abram did. So the journey that Abram does, this arc, really sets the overall sort of narrative trajectory or path that the people of Israel are going to follow from Genesis all the way up until the time of Christ. And then once again, we need to consider the time frame. Just like the journey from Ur to Haran, this journey from Haran down to Egypt would take you over a month to walk if you were able to do it at solid times. Now the picture that's given in Genesis chapter 12 is that this is done in stages. So it's probably a much longer, we're probably talking about several years worth of walking, journeying, stopping. But you really get this picture of Abraham being this migrant from his homeland in Ur all the way around into a foreign land of Haran, and now into the land of Canaan, and then finally they're going to end up down in Egypt. It's a tale of people who are displaced from their homeland, looking for the place that God has promised them to dwell in. The lectionary reading doesn't include this, but I want to put verse 10 in with it because it helps us see this narrative, this journey narrative, and finish it off. In verse 10 of chapter 12 it says, "There was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while because the famine was severe." And so this is the very southern end of the trip. We're not going to get into his adventures or misadventures down there, but I just wanted to bring that in because it gives this first narrative journey, ties it all together. So what do we learn from the overall trajectory of Abraham's journey? First point. In Genesis, Abraham is presented as the forefather to whom God gives the promises and to whom God makes the covenant. And it's linked with a couple specific things: the blessing, the land, and a seed. And these trajectories will carry out through the Old Testament and into the New Testament. Second point, Abraham in the book of Genesis is portrayed as an example of obedience. Now, we don't know a lot of what he's obedient to. Remember, he doesn't have the law. He hasn't had the revelation given to Moses or further revelation. So his knowledge of God is very, very small at this time. But he's obedient to that. And we can see this as Abraham consistently makes altars and worships God. Now, this will conclude with the binding of Isaac later on, which is called the Akedah, or the binding story, which is a very important reading in the Jewish synagogues, readings from the Torah as well. Number 3, the blessing of all nations through Abraham is highlighted in general statements throughout Genesis. And number 4, in the story of Abraham, the central motif is this divine human encounter that comes across. We can see this in these conversations that God has with Abraham. Some of them are really beautiful. For example, when he takes him outside and tells him up to look at the stars of the sky, or number the sand on the sea, or the dust on the earth. There's several other themes that are introduced in the story of Abraham that are important biblically overall. The first one is the threat to God's seed, the promised seed, is constantly placed in jeopardy by the actions of the characters. Abraham taking Sarah and giving her to Pharaoh, Jacob having to flee his brother, Joseph being sent down to Egypt. Constantly, the promises are placed in jeopardy by the characters and the situations in the story. It's a recurring narrative theme, and it shows that only God can bring about his promises. The other thing it shows is that God's promises don't come in the manner we anticipate. This started with Eve when she has a child and she declares, "I've made a man just like God has." And then Cain, that child, the made one, kills Abel, the breath or the vapor. And it's not until they go through this entire tragic story in Genesis chapter 4 that you get to the very end and you get Seth, the seed, the promise that comes. The third child, not the first, not the second, but they lost both of those until they got to the promised one. This idea that the promise always comes in ways that we don't expect is something that's in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. That Mary, this teenage girl, would end up bearing the Messiah, or that the Messiah would die upon a cross. Totally unexpected. And then finally, Abraham's journey prefigures Israel's, which we've talked about. But perhaps most importantly to us, he also shares an important lesson. When God comes up to Abraham and tells him, you go walking, it's a challenge to us as well. First off, we're on a journey during Lent to prepare for Easter. So let's walk with obedience and diligence to prepare for this most high and holy day of the year. Second, Abraham gives us a model for us to imitate as we go into this new day. He remained faithful and kept walking in obedience to God to inherit the promises of God. Let us follow his example and go walking ourselves.